You're listening to Scottish Independent Podcasts, and this week's podcast is called Scotland's Energy Strategy. Is it leading the way or is it sitting on the fence? And this is an episode of Rising Clyde. Our host is Iain Bruce, and Iain's guest this week is Mary Church of Friends of the Earth Scotland. They're going to be talking about the Scottish Government's new energy strategy and just transition plan. Where does it need to go further and faster? And how about hydrogen and carbon capture storage? Are they the solutions that we need?
Hello and welcome to Independence Live. I'm Iain Bruce in Glasgow and this is Rising Clyde, the Scottish Climate Justice Show. On the 10th of January this year, the Scottish Government finally released for public consultation its draft energy strategy and just transition plan. We've been waiting for the document for a year or so because this is the one that should set a course for Scotland to transition away from fossil fuels, especially North Sea oil and gas, towards a genuinely sustainable alternative within this decade. So does it do that? That's what we're talking about on this episode of Rising Clyde. And to help us do that, we're very happy to have with us Mary Church, Head of Campaigns at Friends of the Earth Scotland.
Hi Mary, thank you so much for joining us. I wonder, could we start with just a practical question? What does it mean that this is being put out to public consultation? I mean, how does that work? And is it possible that the document could change substantially, or is that unlikely?
That's a good question, and it's one of the quite important things to understand about this document, and I think has been possibly slightly misrepresented in some of the coverage of the energy strategy. And I think that's to do with the slight divergence between the way some of the questions that are raised in the consultation document were presented as sort of positions when the Cabinet Secretary made his statement to Parliament about it. So you had the statement in Parliament on the 10th of January, and Michael Masterson, the CabSec, kind of spoke as if some of these decisions had already been made. So he strongly implied that the Scottish Government had already taken a position against, presumption against new oil and gas licenses. But when you look at the Energy Strategy Just Transition Plan document, it's very clearly a consultation document which is asking whether the Scottish Government should take a position on new oil and gas licenses, amongst other things. So it clearly is a consultation document. I think it's safe to say that the draft really sort of skirts some of the tricky issues, right? It dodges the big questions, questions that we think the science has already made clear what the answer is to, and puts it out for consultation. So we would hope very much, we would expect very much to see elements of this change and be firmed up in the final draft. And certainly, there's a lot of things that the strategy doesn't do that we think it should do, and we would very much hope it would change on those fronts too.
Okay, let's begin to look at in some detail at some of the more contentious issues, and obviously that key one of whether or not the Scottish Government will approve or support new oil and gas projects. That's obviously absolutely at the centre of this strategy, and as you say, it's being put out there for consultation. But can you explain a bit more what that really means? I mean, I think the key passage is this one, and I'm not sure that it's that easy to understand for ordinary mortals. Whilst licensing is reserved to the UK government, the Scottish Government is consulting on whether, in order to support the fastest possible and most effective just transition, there should be a presumption against new exploration for oil and gas. What does that presumption mean?
Yeah, so good question. And I wonder if I could just go back a couple of steps as well to maybe say a bit more about what this document actually is. So it's a revision. So the Scottish Government has an energy strategy that was, its first energy strategy was published in 2017. And this is a revision of it. Plus it's, tacked on this just transition plan element to deliver on its commitments to deliver sort of sectoral just transition plans for, specifically for the big sectors that are going to need to make that transition to the low carbon economy. Now, energy is broadly reserved to Westminster, so that's quite an important part of this. So offshore oil and gas licensing, coal mining, nuclear, energy supply and transmission, all of these things are reserved to Westminster, although, as your listeners probably know, devolved powers, particularly planning powers, can be used to give effect to the Scottish Government's own energy policy. So that's how we have the effective moratorium on nuclear power, for example, and it's how we initially had a moratorium on fracking before those powers were transferred to the Scottish Government. So the energy strategy covers both devolved and reserved areas. That's an important thing to sort of know about this document. And it goes, the 2017 version also covered devolved and reserved areas, but this one goes further in sort of making propositions for what the Scottish Government thinks the UK government should do in key areas of energy, particularly on oil and gas licensing.
So what exactly is the position here? Because, as you say, before in the 2017 they had this, they were in favour basically of exploiting as much gas and oil as possible, right? Maximum utilization, or whatever the expression was. Yeah? Now, or after COP26, First Minister Nicola Sturgeon came out, actually quite surprisingly initially, but quite clearly, it seemed at the time, against Cambo, the new oil field for Cambo. So that seemed like a change in policy. And then since then, they seem to have been sort of somewhere in the middle. Nobody's quite clear whether they are or they aren't. And they keep talking about, new criteria, climate checkpoints and things that have to be, completed before they'll, so it's quite confusing to me anyway, exactly what their position is, whether they're going to oppose or they're not going to oppose.
Yeah, and I think it's not just you who is confused. I think this is really confusing across the board. And it, that confusion allows space for this sort of contradiction and many different interpretations of the Scottish Government's position to exist within the Scottish Government and within the SNP. So you had even, the leader of the SNP in the House of Commons, in the same week that the document was published, saying, I see no reason why Cambo shouldn't go ahead. So there's this sort of license for confusion and for, interpreting whatever you like out of the situation as it is. So that's something that's clearly got to change between this first draft and the final draft. And I think that confusion has arisen, for a number of reasons. One, this, what I mentioned earlier, the way that the Cabinet Secretary spoke in Parliament made it sound like decisions had already been taken. But when you look at the document itself, it's very clear that, these questions are really up for consultation, so they're being asked. So the key sort of areas on oil and gas is, as you said, this sort of presumption against new oil and gas licensing. Now, just to be clear what that actually means, so that wouldn't stop Cambo going ahead. It wouldn't stop Rosebank going ahead. It wouldn't stop Jackdaw going ahead. All that. So the new licensing rounds that the UK government announced towards the end of last year, where it expects to issue upwards of 100 licenses for new exploration, that would be a presumption against new licensing rounds like that. Okay, for the reserves that we think are out there, but we don't quite know how much are in them, and no company has the rights to explore and exploit them at this point in time. The other thing that the consultation document asks, and that the CabSec proposed in Parliament the other day, is whether or not the Scottish Government should be looking to take a position that says, actually, of the existing licenses, we need to, roll back on those sooner than the sort of natural, or well, not natural, but the economic end of North Sea oil and gas extraction. So it's conducted some analysis, and it's got some figures in there that show that by 2050, North Sea oil and gas extraction would be something like 3% of 1999 levels. So it's kind of saying, and everybody knows, that the industry is in decline anyway, but do we need to say that we should put a stop to extraction sooner than that sort of natural decline? And how soon should that be if we do? And does that mean winding down existing licenses? So this is where you get to the saying no to Cambo, saying no to Rosebank, saying no to Jackdaw, and any other fields that are already under exploration but have not yet been developed, aren't producing economically yet. So those are the two big areas up for discussion in the consultation document. And obviously, because the Scottish Government doesn't actually have the power to, doesn't have power over offshore oil and gas licensing, it would be a position that it'd be the morally correct position, obviously, to take. It would be a position that they take to sort of influence within the UK, to influence the UK government stance and on the global stage, obviously. It would also be a position that they would then have to translate into other areas of domestic where the Scottish Government does have control and power. So, for example, there are a number of funds through which the Scottish Government supports the offshore oil and gas industry. So logically, if it takes this presumption against, it needs to bring those funds in line and hopefully direct them to, the just transition. And of course, in terms of thinking about what would be consistent with, assuming they went for the sort of Paris Agreement goal of 1.5 aligned phase out of oil and gas, if they went for a goal around that, which, in our understanding of the science is this decade, right? It's within this decade. So there's a really useful study by the Tyndall Centre on Climate Change that looks at a kind of a fair shares approach to oil and gas phase out, and it looks at things like it doesn't go too much into the historical responsibility of different producer nations for causing the crisis, although obviously Scotland and the UK do have a significant historical responsibility for causing the crisis. So it doesn't look too much at that area. But what it does look at is, how much of a particular producer nation's economy is sort of tied up with and dependent on the oil and gas industry. What is the GDP of a country? How wealthy is that country? And what would the impacts of transitioning over different timeframes be for that country's economy, and obviously the well-being of its own citizens? And it finds that the UK, and obviously Scotland as part of that, are in this sort of first movers category. They must be in that first movers category of phase out by, they propose a date of 2031 for the UK to do its fair share of a chance of meeting, a 2/3 chance of meeting the 1.5 degrees target. And they also look at,
just to be clear, Mary, that means both no to any new exploration, the first point you made, and no to developing any of those ones that are sort of in the pipeline, as it were. Is that right?
It means no to developing any of the ones that are already licensed but not currently producing. It also means looking at licenses that are areas that are under license and producing, and saying actually we need to stop production sooner in some of these. So it means
there's three levels then, basically, right? No new
Absolutely.
exploration, no new licenses, no development of the ones that are in development, and more quickly winding down the ones that are already there, right?
Yeah. It's very much three different levels. So that's also our view that the Scottish Government should be taking a position of phase out within this decade, and therefore that means looking at these three areas. So if the Scottish Government did take a position like that, then even though it doesn't have the power to stop, take those decisions in relation to the existing licenses or prospective licenses, what it does have is powers to look at energy use in Scotland, right? And do everything it can to ensure that we're using less oil and gas, sort of on a trajectory that's consistent with a phase out within that time frame.
Right. And
so, sorry, just to come back to the question of this is a consultation, I think we would argue that, at this point, in what we know about the climate crisis, it's indisputable. It's indisputable that fossil fuels are driving the crisis. It's indisputable that they need to be phased out ahead of, and certainly in the UK, ahead of economic, the sort of natural economic decline. The question is how we do it. So there's arguably no justification for the Scottish government even asking the question at this stage of the presumption against new licenses. It should have already made that decision. So it's quite disappointing, frankly, to see that as a question in the consultation. They should have already got there.
Another element in this, which is also controversial, is the considerable emphasis on hydrogen as an alternative renewable source, which is, I think, has been welcomed by the industry lobby. So what are the problems that you see with that?
What that is they've basically incorporated the Hydrogen Action Plan, which was published in December last year. And the sort of, the ambition that we're seeing in that is, they're going for 5 gigawatts, which is 15% of Scotland's total energy usage by 2030. And then a whopping great big 25 gigawatts, which is 75% of Scotland's energy usage by 2045. So that's the idea on the hydrogen front. And along with this sort of the gigawatt predictions, you've got some like really quite outrageous job figures in there as well. So there's this huge scope of 70,000 to 300,000 jobs in the hydrogen economy by 2045. And, just for reference, at the upper end of that is considerably more than in the UK oil and gas industry today. It's also around about or more than the numbers employed in the NHS in Scotland. So it's a really huge number of jobs that they're looking at that's not really very well evidenced at all. And the problem with hydrogen is that it either comes from fossil fuels, so that's what's called blue hydrogen, so it keeps the fossil fuel industry going. So blue hydrogen is fossil fuel derived hydrogen combined with carbon capture and storage, which I think we'll come on to a bit later. Or it's derived from renewable energy. It's also what's called green hydrogen. And, green hydrogen sounds great, but the reality is that it's about 5 times less efficient than direct electrification. So, obviously renewables are absolutely essential to the transition away from fossil fuels, but in and of themselves, they're also not without impact, right, on the environment and on communities. So it would be really quite scandalous to just make 5 times more than we need without seriously good justification. And
what is the justification? I mean, why would anybody even think of it?
Well, I think possibly the Scottish Government's justification is, the need to be seen to be creating some kind of industry that will sort of like for like replace the jobs in the oil and gas industry. It's also, it's being pushed by the oil and gas lobby, right? Hydrogen.
But why? Why explain that bit to me?
So the green hydrogen won't work. The blue hydrogen enables the oil and gas industry to keep going, and arguably the green hydrogen industry enables the oil and gas industry to keep on going as well, because it won't work, right? So it's along with CCS, it's one of these false solutions being pushed by the fossil fuel industry to extend its own sort of lifespan and to sort of just squeeze the last profits from the industry. So,
but I think I read in Friends of the Earth's own study on this. I mean, you would accept some use of hydrogen, right, for some industrial purposes. Yeah.
So it doesn't make sense to use hydrogen where direct electrification can work, right? Because otherwise you're building 5 times as many windmills for the same amount, for the same amount that one could do through direct electrification, right? And so the 2 areas where it really doesn't make sense to use, and that the Scottish Government has been, quite sort of, especially with the homes and heating and sort of light transport, are 2 areas where the Scottish Government has been actively, supporting hydrogen, green hydrogen, and blue hydrogen. It doesn't make sense in these sectors because you can do direct electrification. So where it may make sense is in some heavy industry and for shipping and aviation. Yeah. And, there's this, so it's possible that the Scottish Government's thinking on hydrogen is sort of geared towards export markets. But again, that doesn't necessarily fly, because other nations, where we're talking about small production of green hydrogen for heavy industry, countries will be making that in their own localities. It's not necessarily a sensible thing for the export market. So the whole sort of hydrogen plan is sort of massively flawed and needs rethinking. And sorry, this has all been quite a doom and gloom sort of response so far, but there is one sort of positive in there, that there's a line in the draft strategy that makes it sound like the Scottish Government are open to reconsidering their position on hydrogen for domestic heating. So that is a good thing.
Presumably, if it doesn't work, they'll have to reconsider it anyway, basically,
Yes, but the question is whether it will be, how late in the day do you reconsider it, and how far down, how much more climate pollution has gone into the atmosphere by the time we reconsider it. That's the problem with full solutions like hydrogen and carbon capture and storage.
Let's do that one then. Let's move on to that one then. Yeah. Carbon capture and storage, because that's also part of the hydrogen equation, as you say, on the blue hydrogen.
Exactly.
So this is the idea that you can sort of like continue to emit CO2 and then seize it out of the air and shove it under the ground or under the sea, right? That's the basic idea, yeah?
Basically, yes. And
what's the problem?
Well, there's lots of different issues with it, and one of the big ones is, it's sort of basically failed to get off the ground, despite many decades of research and development supported by governments around the world, US in particular, also in the UK and in the EU. It's really hasn't really got off the ground. So, you've got 26 plants around the world today, only 26 plants, and they are capturing less than 0.1% of global emissions at present. Of those plants, 81% of the carbon that is captured is actually being used to extract more oil as part of a process called enhanced oil recovery. So it is just one of these sort of fantasy techno fixes that, the idea that we can just keep on doing what we're doing and nothing really needs to change. Because we've got these sort of technological fixes. It's very much in that sort of, in that school. So, keeping oil and gas industry profits flowing. So there are no sites operating in the UK, despite sort of all these competitions over the years and financing over the years. There are no sites operating in the UK. The Scottish Government has, there's not a huge amount that's actually new in the draft energy strategy on the carbon capture and storage front. These plans have been embedded in their climate change reduction plans for the last couple of years, and they have been, heavily critiqued by 4 parliamentary committees who said, we don't like the look of this, you need to come up with a plan B. They've also been critiqued by the UK Climate Change Committee, so the Scottish Government's statutory advisors on climate change, who also said effectively the same thing. We need to see a plan B in case your carbon capture plans don't work. And, just to put it in perspective there, by 2030, they were looking at capturing something like a quarter of Scotland's emissions through carbon capture and storage. And by 2032, a fifth by 2030, and then going up to a quarter by 2032. So that was the idea in the climate change plan. Last year, a report was sort of quietly published by the Scottish Government that admitted that, there was no way that carbon capture and storage in Scotland was actually going to deliver this decade. Basically,
there seems to be a problem here, isn't there, of conception? Even if the Scottish Government, and we very much hope it does, or you very much hope it does, and so do I, they do go for the sort of like a complete halt to new gas and oil and gas projects and winding down the existing ones much faster. They still seem to basically want everything to go on as it is, kind of thing. You know what I mean? It's kind of like, we can do a bit of this and we can do a bit of that, but don't worry, because it's all going to be kind of like as you know it. And I suppose maybe the argument is that a lot of things need to change. That doesn't make it have to change for the worse. Doesn't mean we have to sort of like all live in total, austerity and, but the way we do things, the way we consume energy, the way we live with energy and other resources has to change in a way that the Scottish government doesn't really seem to be wanting to talk about very much. Am I misinterpreting here?
No, I mean, I think that's right. And I think it's also, fair to say that we've got to the end of the sort of low-hanging fruit. There's no more low-hanging fruit left when it comes to carbon emissions reduction. So it's only the tough decisions left to make. Like, it's the nuts and bolts. How do we actually do this? To be fair and to have some sympathy for people in positions of power having to make these difficult decisions, not everyone is going to like the decisions that are going to be made, by which I partly mean, the corporations who have too much sway over most governments in this day and age. So, they can't keep business, big corporations happy and meet climate targets, right? So that's sort of what we're coming up against now. And I mean, so difficult decisions ahead. But I think you're right to say that things have to change, on a systemically. But that doesn't mean things getting worse for your average person necessarily. So a lot of the changes that a lot of the solutions that we know are essential to meeting our climate targets will actually make things better for ordinary people, right? So, mass rollout of home energy insulation, for example, which will reduce people's bills, give people warmer homes, like comfortable homes to live in. A mass rollout and mass investment in public transport infrastructure so that communities are better connected, people are better connected, affordable public transport so that people can get around, right? As part of the modal shift away from private cars, which are, a major, major problem. The transport sector has been underperforming in the emissions reductions over many, many years now. So lots of the solutions to the climate crisis will actually make things better on a day-to-day basis for ordinary people.
And that's part of the argument about the just bit of the just transition, right? I mean, the just transition is about green jobs, and it's not just about having new jobs for North Sea oil workers. It's a much broader thing about how you make this transition, a positive, experience and a life-enhancing experience for the population at large, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. And actually, it's good to sort of move on to the just transition aspect of it. So I think I mentioned earlier that this is different from the previous or the existing energy strategy, in that it's an energy strategy and just transition plan for the energy sector. So this is the first of 4 sectoral just transition plans that the Scottish government has undertaken as part of its commitments to deliver a just transition. And frankly, it's not much of a just transition plan. So there's lots of pull-out boxes in the document with nice sort of speculative jobs figures and things in them. So lots of nice words on just transition. There are a series of just transition outcomes in the document, but no real plan to deliver on them. And I think this is, when you think about the headlines that have been circulating around this, so some parts of the press and political spectrum have been interpreted as the Scottish government taking a position already against oil and gas, right? And if you're an offshore oil and gas worker and you hear the Scottish government is putting an end date on oil and gas, and you look at this document, you're not going to see anything in it that gives you comfort that you're going to be looked after, right? And that, the whole point about just transition is how do we avoid, so we know we need to make massive changes in our economy, in the energy that sort of the energy system that sort of fuels that economy. How do we avoid the horrendous and really long-term damaging impacts of the transition away from, for example, the coal mining industry? That's what a just transition plan. So you're right about the wider things about improving things for everyone as part of the transition, but it also needs to really look at the needs at the impact on and the needs of workers and communities whose livelihoods and communities are really tied to and dependent on the high carbon industry. So particularly.
And on that specific aspect, what do you think is missing in this? What would you like to see added? I mean, what would you be proposing to add?
I mean, it isn't a just transition plan, right? It's not a plan. It doesn't say how it's going to deliver a just transition. So it's sort of, to a certain extent, it's a bit back to the drawing board. What it needs to do is, it needs to go beyond the sort of speculative jobs figures. It needs to, properly assess where jobs are at risk from certain policies, right? So if your policy is to, if the policy ends up to be phasing out oil and gas by whatever date, then what would the proposals, at least for the policies to put in place to ensure that workers are supported in that transition, either supported into new jobs through training and support schemes, or early retirement schemes, or job guarantee schemes. So it really needs to go into the detail of those things. And I think another part of the just transition plan really needs to look at different models of energy ownership. So part of the problem is the corporations sort of stranglehold on the industry. They've got no interest to stop taking oil and gas out of the ground, and the companies that are supplying and selling energy have very little interest in home energy efficiency improvements, for example, because then theoretically they sell less energy to the consumer. So something like a publicly owned energy company could help sort of address those things. A company that had public spirited sort of goals and aims rather than the bottom line for the shareholder. So there was a proposal, a Scottish government commitment actually, to establish a publicly owned energy company. That plan was for more of a white label company that would just buy energy off suppliers and sort of bundle it up and sell it on.
Whereas what you're talking about is something with a lot more power than that.
What
right?
we're talking about is something with more power, something that can generate energy as well, and could also make interventions in support home energy efficiency, for example. And so some kind of national publicly owned energy company, but also supporting local authorities to do this kind of thing at the local level, and communities as well. So those are some of the things that we'd want to see in there on the just transition front. I think it's also worth saying there's the just transition within Scotland, but we've also got to think about the just transition at the global level, and how this sort of intersects with the plans to move to a more circular economy. Yeah, so yes, we have to transition to renewables, but I think I said this earlier, that renewables are not without their impact. You need steel, like millions of tons of steel will be needed to build the wind turbines for the ScotWind project alone. And then of course you've also got the sort of critical minerals that go into the sort of mechanism of wind turbines, solar panels, all the rest of it. And the production and extraction of these materials is not without harm, to put it mildly. So we really need to be thinking about the impact of our transition overseas, right? So it's the pace of our transition in terms of meeting our international climate obligations and doing our fair share of that, which means moving faster. But it's also, thinking about our overall demand consumption. So we shouldn't just be aiming to replace like for like in terms of energy usage. We should be really looking at ways to reduce energy usage so that we need less sources of generation. We need fewer wind turbines, we need fewer solar panels and all the rest of it, and trying to address issues in the supply chain for the minerals and other materials that are needed to build these things. And one sort of reasonably sort of quick win on that front would be looking at the steel component. And most of the steel that is used in Scotland, at the end of its sort of initial usage, it's sent overseas for recycling. And if we had something like an electric arc furnace here in Scotland, we could be recycling and recasting our scrap steel here in Scotland to build wind turbines.
Just on that international, the supply chain element, rare earth minerals and lithium and balsa wood and all those other kind of things that are tied up in the renewables. And obviously it's immensely complicated, and I'm not asking you to come up with a solution, but what do you think the sort of principles of an approach to that could or should be? I mean, how do you deal with that? How do you approach the fact that you are going to need to get balsa wood out of, Amazonian rainforests, or lithium out of, Bolivia or wherever? How do you do that in a just way? What are the principles you begin to apply to do that?
Yeah, so I mean, those are really big questions, and actually we're commissioning a study at the moment on critical minerals in Scotland's energy transition. So I hope that will help us sort of establish some of the answers to that. But I think part of it is about, as I said, demand reduction, right? So minimizing what we need in the first place, right, to reduce harm, and recycling, obviously, as much as possible of all of these different materials. So you're no longer just extracting the raw materials. So reuse and recycling of materials, that's got to be absolutely fundamental. Acknowledging the problem in the first place, right? So not being silent on it in the first place, and incorporating this into the energy strategy, incorporating this into the circular economy bill as well, which is coming forward this year. So one of the things that we are calling for in the circular economy bill is consumption-based targets. So both consumption-based targets for materials and also for carbon. And actually the carbon one will also help with, the problem of offshoring our emissions, which has also been part of what's led to the decline of, heavy industry and the loss of those, the jobs associated with that in Scotland. So establishing a framework that helps us think about how we reduce our use of materials, I think, is a fundamental part of tackling that question.
And just maybe to end, I mean, the fact that the Scottish government has taken a bit of an initiative on loss and damage at COP27, for example, and before, we can argue, this is another discussion for another program, but we can argue about the adequacy or inadequacies of what's been done so far on that. But there is at least appears to be a sensitivity to that issue.
It's interesting you mentioned COP27. One of the outcomes at COP27 was a sort of an elevation of just transition into what's called the cover decision, and the establishment of a work program on just transition, and the sort of expansion of, so just transition came into the Paris Agreement initially in quite a narrow sort of framing, like narrow but important framing around protecting workers' rights, and that was on the back of many years of campaigning by the International Trade Union movement. But what COP27 did was sort of flesh that out a little bit, and think about just transition as more of a sort of in terms of sort of global issues and global relationships, and the pace of different transitions around the world. So actually, I think the UNFCCC, sorry, the UN regime, climate regime space is a place where we can increasingly have that conversation, and the Scottish government does engage in that space. So it's yes, let's have it there. It's also the First Minister committed to a feminist foreign policy for the Scottish government, and that, I think, is in the early stages of sort of consulting on what that should look like. And actually, I was at a really interesting workshop the other day where some, nicely radical definitions of what that should look like were being put forward. So that's another sort of arena that we can raise these issues, right?
There's many more aspects of this we could talk about, but we've already gone a bit over time, Mary. So thank you so much for explaining all that to us. And let's hope you presumably will be submitting something to the consultation, right, as Friends of the Earth?
Absolutely. And we are also intending to sort of come up with some resources to help other people respond to the consultation if they want to as well. So we really encourage people to do that.
Excellent. Yeah, well, please do let us know, and we'll distribute those as far as we can, help circulate. Thank you so much, Mary. That's the end of this episode of Rising Clyde. Until next time. Bye-bye.
You're listening to Scottish Independence Podcast, and that was the latest episode of Rising Clyde. The host was Iain Bruce, and his guest was Mary Church from Friends of the Earth Scotland. If you'd like to catch up with previous episodes of Rising Clyde, you'll find them on our website at scottishindiepod.scot. Thanks again for listening, and we'll be back again next Friday with our next podcast.